Good afternoon. My name is Carlos Mariani, State Representative from St. Paul. I have the privilege to chair the Minnesota House Committee on Public Safety and Criminal Justice Reform. Today we want to share some broad thoughts about what we're doing different and new this year. And in particular, we want to talk to you about probation because we have a big focus on probation reform this year. We will be joined shortly by Mayor Melvin Carter of St. Paul. He's running a little bit late, but we'll usher him up here as quickly as possible to take part in the press conference. And with that, I'm going to ask Sarah Walker to kick us off.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. So Minnesota law governing felony probation sentences are open-ended, which often result in varying probation terms across the state and extremely lengthy probation sentences, particularly for nonviolent drug offenses. And Minnesota has a long history of truth in sentencing that has been upheld and reinforced through our Sentencing Guidelines Commission. However, if probation is the likely sentence in Minnesota, which it very often is, there is currently no way to predict the length of probation because Minnesota law permits the courts to set the probation terms anywhere between 4 years and the statutory maximum of 40 years. The Minnesota Department of Corrections supports efforts that bring geographic uniformity to our system of probation and that will help reduce the overburdened caseloads of our dedicated community service agents. Geographic consistency coupled with caseload reductions allows probation agents to target their time and resources on the highest risk, highest need individuals, and that helps provide a greater return on our public safety investment. Effective probation can both prevent future crime and allow for client rehabilitation. Lengthy terms result in increased overburdened caseloads and increased costs to state and local units of governments. The bipartisan approaches that have been put forward in the House and Senate will help eliminate some of the geographic disparities in probation lengths and will allow probation officers the time and resources to help reduce technical violations. A reduction in the technical violations will also go a long way to help alleviating some of the pressures within our institutions, because when individuals are technically violated, they are often returned to prison for short periods of time in which they are essentially warehoused without any programming. So we believe the approaches offered by the legislators in the House are as part of a solution for overall probation reform in the state of Minnesota. So thank you.
Thank you. And I neglected to identify Ms. Walker as Assistant Commissioner for the Department of Corrections. Again, my name is Carlos Mariani, Rosa State Representative from St. Paul, and I'm here with my DFL and Republican colleagues to announce our bipartisan efforts to pursue legislation that shifts how Minnesotans can deepen our responsibility to keep one another safe from crime and, meanwhile, build strong communities. Quite simply, we want to be better at promoting public safety, and we know that there is strong evidence that demonstrates the effectiveness of using a community-centered public safety approach. This approach is meant to accomplish safer neighborhoods, towns, cities, and counties throughout our state. A community-centered public safety approach goes hand in hand with criminal justice reform, which is focused on not criminalizing every mistake or minor bad acts, but instead creating ways for the person to make things right, to better themselves, and to reconcile with the community. It also recognizes that Minnesota is unfortunately part of the mass correction state that disproportionately punishes Black, Brown, Indigenous people in particular. We want to end that and build a better way to address offenses. Community-centered public safety recognizes that not all problems can be solved solely by the police, solely by an incarceration approach, solely by a probation system that is set up only to catch a person when he or she fails. Indeed, instead, community-centered public safety looks for ways to have everyone in the community solve problems. Counselors, schools, faith community, local courts, nonprofits, survivor groups, and more. Community-centered public safety asks the question, how do we hold someone who offended accountable while building a strong community where all members work together to solve problems and to make people whole? The House Committee began this new direction this year by focusing on the rights of sexual assault survivors and by addressing post-conviction remedies, for example, for those who are immigrants about to be torn away from their communities through deportation. This week, as Assistant Commissioner Walker shared, we will begin looking at probation reform efforts, and we will be looking at supporting and maintaining, in the coming weeks, we'll be looking at supporting and maintaining police integrity, juvenile justice reform, and building capacity for community-based interventions and supports. And so with that, we have a few members of the committee and others that will speak, beginning with Representative O'Neill. I think my mayor is here, Mayor Carter from St. Paul. Representative Considine, who will be sharing a message from Greater Minnesota, as well as a survivor, and then Representative Long, who will be carrying a major probation reform bill this year. And so with that, I want to turn to my good friend, Representative Marion O'Neill.
Thank you, Chair Mariani. It's been an honor to serve with you, and I have to say that the relationship that we've already built is just incredibly strong. I am so honored to be here with him and to move forward some of this legislation. And some of this legislation has begun a bit longer than just this year, and I'd like to mention that. So back in 2017, when the Department of Corrections came and began to share some of their statistics with us, it was really startling. And it did demonstrate that about 60% of those returning to prison were returning because of a technical violation and not a new crime that had been committed. And I was incredibly inspired by a Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge as one to get a hold of that and really come up with a solution. And I'm proud to say that it was launched, it was passed into law. Alternatives to Incarceration was launched in 2017, implemented in 2018. And we now have about 1 year worth of data, and it's incredible. The results are small, but shocking and incredible, shocking in the best kind of way. And what it says is that of the participants in Anoka County where they did the pilot, they saw a 61% reduction in those returning to prison. Now, these are people that were absolutely set on going back to prison, 100%. They had already been on that road. That's where they were headed, and because of a technical violation, not because of a new crime that was committed. And again, these are nonviolent drug offenders are the people that are in this program. To see a 61% reduction in those returning to prison was amazing. And so I'm partnering with Chair Mariani to expand this program. We're going to hear this bill on Wednesday. I am so incredibly proud to roll this out, hopefully tripling the funding. We'll see. It is a budget year. That is our hope, and to expand the pilot past Anoka County. Also, another piece that we were able to do in the very recent past was expand specialty courts or treatment courts across the entire state. So it had been confined to certain jurisdictions, and I was proud to be the chief author to move that across the entire state and fund it. Now, we're also working on hopefully bolstering that budget for specialty courts, and I do have a bill coming forward for that. So these are just a couple real examples of how we can intervene in people's lives, help them to get the treatment that they actually need, where 85% of those in the entire criminal justice system have a chemical dependency of some sort. So we really want to focus on, can we help them to recover and have hope and have a new life? And that's what I'm proud to be here today to stand with my colleagues to do.
Thank you. Mayor Carter.
Thank you very much. It's good to see you. Sorry. It's good to see you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for your leadership in helping us build this platform. I'm excited to be here today, joining leaders in our capital who share a commitment to improving the way our justice system serves residents across the state. As mayor of the city of St. Paul, we know that to truly address long-term systemic issues in our community, we need to view the problems we face through a new lens. And we need to do that. We need to engage in comprehensive justice reform. Because the old ways of addressing the challenges we face today and those that we'll face in the future simply aren't working. and won't work moving forward as communities everywhere continue to grow and change. In St. Paul, we've developed our community-first public safety framework to place residents at the center of the conversation on how we address challenges. Early in my administration, we engaged in a community feedback process to review and revise our police department's use of force policy. We recently completed a comprehensive audit of our K-9 unit, and we worked with the St. Paul City Council this past year to invest in the police department's mental health unit. But community-first public safety isn't just about our emergency responders. It's about creating a city that requires us to call upon emergency responders less. I heard in your comments, and I appreciate this focus, that shifts our perspective on public safety from one that measures ourselves based on how many police officers we hire and how many people we send to prison, to one that focuses on how many people we can prevent sending to prison and how many times we can prevent the need to call 911 in the first place. It means going upstream from chasing symptoms to addressing the root causes of insecurity and lack of opportunity that so often lead to crime. That's why in St. Paul we've raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour, invested heavily in affordable housing, and expanded programming in our libraries, parks, and recreation centers. Together, these investments embody our community-first public safety framework and help to build a city that works for all of us. But you know that cities can't do this work alone. We need partners at every level of government, along with partners in our nonprofit sector to help usher this vital work forward. Minnesota has one of the highest probation rates in the country, with 25% of the population at Stillwater Correctional Facility there for violating probation. I just heard the representative say 60% of the people who go into prison in Minnesota go not for committing a new crime, but for a technical violation of probation. While risk of reoffense drops significantly as years pass, our state still imposes lengthy, extended probation sentences that hinder people's ability to function as contributing members of our communities, leaving them isolated and cut off from the greater economic prosperity of our region and state, and creating enormous public costs for taxpayers to shoulder. I'm encouraged by the collective voice of the leaders here today who share a commitment to community-first, community-centered public safety through alternatives to incarceration and probation reforms. Here in Minnesota, across the country, and even in Washington, D.C., I'm encouraged by bipartisan support for these reforms and the partnerships that this bipartisan support can cultivate. Now more than ever, in a polarizing national landscape and in a time where rhetoric intended to divide us has become the norm, it is critical and it's hopeful to see that we in Minnesota can still be champions of local unity. The things we have in common, the values we share, the hopes and dreams we have for our children and for our communities, and for the communities we want to build for our grandchildren require us to move forward together in this way. There's much work left to do, but I'm encouraged by the leadership of those who are here today. Thank you all for your leadership, your bold leadership, who with one voice are making it loud and clear that there are many opportunities for us to partner to solve the challenges we face. By doing so together, we truly are working together to build a state that works for all of us. Thank you all for your leadership. Thank you all for being here.
In full disclosure, I'm a substitute for Todd Miller, who was the Public Safety Director in Mankato. Mankato embraced...
And you are who?
Oh, I should probably say that. I'm Representative Jack Considine. I chair the Subcommittee on Corrections. A little over 10 years ago, Mankato embraced community policing. And as Director Miller mentioned, it's not just community policing, it's community governance, in which you need to have the entire city staff and government on board. That's the way it works. From a personal point, one of my proudest moments was shortly after this, driving by local Lutheran church, and there was a police car sitting there, and Officer Mortensen, I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning his name, was sitting on the hood of the car engaging 5 young African Americans. And I'm going, this is starting to work already. Now, does it work? In December, Mankato was named the 9th safest place to raise a family in a metro area in the United States. And probably more importantly, in October, we were the second safest place to have trick-or-treating, only behind Lincoln, Nebraska. So, thank you.
Jennifer?
Hello. My name is Jennifer Schroeder. I am a St. Paul resident, and I am currently serving a 40-year probation sentence for a nonviolent drug crime. I was also sentenced to 365 days in the county jail, which is 1 day short of a prison sentence, and I have 98 months hanging over my head, which means for the next, until I'm 71 years old, I have the potential of going to prison for 10 years for anything. The judge could violate me on any charge because that is what a downward departure does. I have, since that charge, went to school and graduated. I am an alcohol and drug counselor. I am constantly faced with roadblocks such as housing. I have to check the box. I have to do set-asides every time I want to apply for a new job. I have to do background studies that don't come back for months at a time, which means I have to disclose to everybody involved my past. I work with clients who are on less probation than me, and it's kind of hard to be taken seriously if they were to go onto the BBC and check my name, because that's all they would have to do to see that I'm serving a 40-year probation sentence. It's hard to be taken seriously as a professional. It's hard to be taken seriously by anybody. I feel uncomfortable a lot of times and embarrassed and ashamed because I don't know what people in a higher position are thinking. I don't know if I will be taken seriously, and it has affected my life dramatically. I spoke to my probation officer on the phone for 40 minutes today. We have a great relationship. If she could discharge me, she would. She was at my college graduation. I am 6 years into my probation sentence right now, and I will not be eligible even for early release until 20 years. 20 years is my earliest that she can apply for my release, because in Wright County, you serve 3 years out of every 5-year sentence, mandatory. I can't vote. I follow politics more than most people I know. I watch the debates with my grandma, and I can't vote. Till I'm 71 years old, my voice is silenced because of a nonviolent drug charge that happened to be for a driving violation is why I was pulled over. And I'm not trying to make any kind of excuses because I could justify it all day long. I come from a crappy childhood, and I was a drug addict, and I was putting drugs into the community, and I obviously feel terrible about that, but I have to ask, when is a point where what you have done and what you are continuing to do is enough to say that you are fully a member of society again? Also, this is very inspiring to see a committee of people that are for Minnesotans, because the whole wring dry and throw you back into the same environment isn't working anymore, and all we're doing is creating more problems, because the reoffenses, I was fortunate, I look at it, to spend a year in jail, because that is about how much time your brain needs to heal from an addiction. And when you go in for 30 days and then send them right back into the environment that they came from, you can't expect much more than the same behavior. So hopefully this gets the ball rolling on some really awesome stuff. I'm excited to see what happens in the future.
Thank you. Representative Long?
My name is Representative Jamie Long, and Minnesota is failing the fundamental test of fairness in our probation system. I don't think anybody can hear Jennifer's story, and thank you for coming forward and being willing to share it today, and not think that our state is engaging in unfair, excessive punishment. We are an outlier nationally when you look at our probation terms. We like to think of ourselves as a state that's fairly reform-minded when it comes to criminal justice, and if you look at our incarceration lengths, we're the 47th state in the country in terms of the length of time folks are incarcerated. But we're the 5th state in the country when you look at probation terms, and if you combine the two, that makes us the 13th state in terms of the total time that somebody is under supervision in the state of Minnesota. So we are a national outlier when it comes to the amount of punishment that we are providing to Minnesotans. And as you can hear from Jennifer, that has real life impacts on individuals. Folks in other states, when they hear that we have 40-year probation terms, can't believe it. That's not something that is normal across the United States. We have states across this country that have much more reasonable probation terms, and those aren't states that you might stereotype, right? Alabama, Mississippi have 5-year probation caps. Iowa, Missouri, states that are pure Midwestern states to us, have 5-year probation caps. So these are reasonable policies that are instituted around the country and work well. We're also failing the test of fairness when you look at the regional disparities that happen in our state. That's right. Just to talk about drugs, for example, if you are sentenced to a drug crime in the Duluth Judicial District, then your average sentence is going to be about 3 years. If you're sentenced for drug crimes in the Rochester Judicial District, it's about 9 years. So 3 times as long for the same type of crime, depending on where you are in this state. That's not right. That's not fair. And that's something that we're here to change. So the bill that we're going to be hearing in committee later this afternoon, is a bill that would institute a 5-year cap on probation terms with exceptions for murder and sexual assault. It has 4 Republican co-authors in addition to a number of Democrats. It's a bipartisan proposal, and we're really looking forward to hearing that bill and talking about how we can move forward on probation to have a much more reasonable and fair system. We're also hearing a bill that I'm authoring later this week, which is going to be working with the Sentencing Guideline Commission to take a look at probation and try to address some of these regional disparities that we're seeing in sentencing and see if we can come up with a system in Minnesota that is much more equal in terms of how we're treating people for similar crimes, and that is not doling out excessive punishment like 40-year probation terms or even 9 years when you're getting 3 in other parts of the state. So thank you, Chair Mariani, for taking on this important issue, and thank you again, Jennifer, for sharing your support.
Questions?
Thank you. I also want to acknowledge very quickly Representative Poston, who's with us here today, as well as representatives from the CPO and CCA-based, county-based probation delivery systems. And so with that, we're open to questions.
So do judges currently not have any leeway on some of these technical violations? They have no discretion? Do they just, is it automatic?
They have discretion.
The judge has way too much, they are the deciders.
Why don't you come on up?
The judge is able,
Part of the description said that one of the bills would give judges more discretion on technical violations, so it made me think they don't have enough or something, so.
I think the idea here is to provide guidance for judges beyond what's currently available to them. One of the things that we also want to be doing this week is sending messages and expectations of our Sentencing Guidelines Commission to address probation. We believe they have the authority and the duty to do so, and they've been a bit silent on that issue. And we think they have a very important role to play that can also help guide judicial decisions.
Chair Mariani, I was given permission to speak with an inmate at the prison, and we talked about technical violations. And what he described was there's a guy on his block who's in prison right now because he had a video game. He says that cell phones are an extremely common reason for people to be violated. Can you talk a little bit more about what these technical violations really are? What's the nature of these violations?
Well, I can't speak to the decision-making in terms of but I do think that what we're trying to address is a system that's focused on the wrong things. We want a system that's focused on the helpful corrective things, particularly our high-risk offenders who are amenable to treatment, to counseling. It's going to require more intensive work. And so as opposed to having a probation system that's really set up to just watch and wait for you to make a little mistake, we want a much more helpful probation system that interacts in real ways with the lives of the folks that are in the corrections system. Assistant Commissioner.
I just want to say, so yes, the Department of Corrections has made a commitment to reduce technical violations. and we'll be looking at a number of these. But I would also like to say that there has been a lot of innovative work, including Representative O'Neill's bill. But one of the big issues, and part of the reasons the Department of Correction supports finding solutions to reduce probation lengths, is one, the longer you're on probation, the more likely you are to get caught in a technical violation. The other thing is that there is a lot of discretion. So there are not, offenders come out with guidelines, but there is a lot of discretion. But without resources, particularly in greater Minnesota, for probation officers to send their clients to, there are often limited options for them to use to try to reduce these violations. So we think that these proposals in whole would in fact help reduce caseloads and allow us to reinvest resources where they are most needed in greater Minnesota and in a lot of the counties that are doing this innovative work.
This fellow also sort of described that as a safety issue inside the prison, because there are these people who are frustrated, who don't feel they belong in jail, and they're a large portion of the population in the blocks. Is it a safety issue, these technical
I
violations?
think that the Minnesota Department of Corrections position would be that we in fact believe there is a link between what happens on the outside with the probation officers and what happens on the inside in terms of safety. When people are returned to prison for short-term violations, they are often not eligible for programming. When anyone is idle for long periods of time, it creates an unsafe environment. So we believe solving some of the technical violation problems will also increase the amount of security in the institutions.
To be clear, just by way of definition, the technical violation, just by way of definition, the technical violation, we're referring to something that isn't a crime outside of you being on supervised release. And so if the terms of probation include staying away from alcohol or, something along those lines, or staying away from cell phone usage or whatever those things are, then those things that for the rest of us might not necessarily be something that we're proud of or would recommend doing, but wouldn't be a crime that would result in imprisonment for people who are on supervised release or probation. Those things, or even if it's determined that you're not doing a good enough job looking for employment, those types of things can result in landing a person back in prison.
What about no contact orders? Are those included in terms of technical violations as well, or is that a different category?
That would be a different category.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, may I ask you also, do we have bipartisan support to the degree that this can clear the Minnesota House of Representatives? And maybe what's your assessment of the Senate on it?
I believe we do. As Representative O'Neill shared, some of these ideas actually had bipartisan support last year and were passed. And due to the way the session ended, a number of those issues languished. And so part of this is really lifting up some of that good work from last year and then adding more good work. I am hopeful relative to the Senate. I've met with my counterpart, Senator Limmer, and he's expressed some interest and has some history of wanting to, it's my words, community-centered approach, but wanting to have a system where there's restorative, good interventions that actually help people move on with their lives and redeem themselves, but also build strong communities. So I'm really hopeful relative to my counterparts in the Senate.
Can I ask you about voting? Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that there have been ongoing conversations with our law enforcement partners, including the county attorneys, to try to find an agreement that everyone can agree on, and we believe that will help clear the pathway to making this something that all people can support in the Minnesota legislature.
I ask you about voting rights. The majority leader in the Senate has said to us that he does not expect to be hearing the primary voting rights bill, but that he was open to bills that were reducing the length of probation, particularly in drug crimes. So it seems from those statements that this is an area that he might be willing to pursue, and it would have the effect of a sooner restoration of voting rights for people. Is that a conversation you guys are having or willing to have with the Senate as tying this particular bill in with the voting rights bill?
I'm encouraged by the comments. I had not heard them before. We certainly have a strong interest in being assertive around a number of us, particularly on my side of the aisle. I can't speak for the other side. I'll let them do that. But we have a strong interest in voter restoration. And I think your question really points out the amount of room that's possible in terms of moving steadily in that direction. So I'm really encouraged by what I'm hearing you relaying in terms of what you heard from the majority leader.
Jennifer, can you describe your interactions with your probation officer or supervised release officer? I mean, how do those interactions go?
Currently or in the beginning? I mean, it's in the beginning, it was once a month I had to drive up from the cities to Wright County and meet with her, and it was like that for the first 2 years. I never violated. I did above and beyond what they were asking of me, but because I wanted change and I was done, and I had a lot of drive and fire under me because I was angry. I was angry at a lot of different things, and through that, we became friends. She came to my college graduation, like I said. I mean, she's a very supportive person in my recovery. She's not a authoritative figure, which so many people do have, though. A lot of people are not so fortunate to have a probation officer that's proactive in their life. And she would definitely violate me if she had to, though. And so that is always in the back of my head. And that fear is another thing that I have to live with. You know, like that fear is within me all the time, every day. So that keeps, I don't know how to put it. My probation officer is an awesome lady. So her name is Ivory Loftus.
Is there a danger of an equal and opposite reaction here? If you reduce probations, is it possible that you'll then increase prison terms? You've got a pretty deeply divided Sentencing Guidelines Commission. They did increase a few penalties. They increased the duration of sentences on a few penalties. And there are some folks on that commission who might react badly to this idea, because the idea is that probation is being exacted in order to reduce prison terms.
I think we have a wonderful base to work from historically, quite frankly. I think you're correct that, as the first state to develop a sentencing guidelines commission, with very early movements of understanding that our probation component should be that community restorative, getting people back quickly into productive existence in our state. That is our history as a people, as a state, and we've kind of forgotten that. And so my hope, quite frankly, is that the commission and the rest of us don't look at it as an either or. It's really about how do we continue to evolve our probation work to the next level of intervention and community building.